I think we're rolling here. All right, so looking at our notes today, there's kind of, when you look at these notes, there's three kind of distinct sections, I guess. There's kind of a history lesson, kind of how this whole thought process of evolution even came to be. Then we look at Darwin's kind of his main points of his theory of evolution, and then finally we look at pieces of evidence for evolution. So there's about, I think, like 6 or 7 different things that we go through that show that you can use to see like how related organisms are, or you can use them to see kind of a common ancestor for organisms. So that's what we're going to look at. So history, then the points of the theory of evolution, kind of the main points of it, and then finally these pieces of evidence that support the theory of evolution. So the first thing, I'll turn the light. I know when I record the screen, it gets a little darker up there for some reason, so I'll turn the lights off. So the first thing, looking at kind of the history of it, these scientists that kind of built this whole theory, the first guy that ever even like thought about how organisms came to be was Aristotle, famous first century thinker, and he basically just, hey, everything's here and nothing's ever changed, and that theory was it was right for like 2,000 years. Everything just kind of came to be, and ta-da! All the organisms you see have never changed; they've always been the way they are. That started kind of the thinking for that early in the 1800s started getting challenged. The first guy came along, and his last name was Lamarck, and he started having this idea that, okay, we start seeing these fossils, and we know that there are some organisms that aren't here anymore, that used to live, millions of years ago, or they didn't have a concept of millions of years, but a long time ago. So now, why do things look the way they do now? So he started thinking about, well, it must be because they use their body parts or they don't use their body parts. So if they use it, it's going to get stronger or longer or bigger or whatever else. And if they don't use it, then it's going to kind of die off. And so a perfect example would be like the giraffe. So he thought the giraffe, got its long neck because, it stretched it out to try and reach those leaves. And so as it stretched it, it made it longer. And then it had babies. Stretched it out, and their neck got longer, and so on and so on and so on. And again, that would be kind of the same thing as saying, like, all right, well, if I'm a bodybuilder, then my babies are going to be born with big muscles because I have big muscles. Well, that's not the way things work. And again, we kind of understand that now. But back in his day, they didn't really, they didn't know much about genetics and all that. So they just thought, well, if they're using their neck, then it's going to stretch out longer, and then their babies are going to have long necks too. And again, that's not really the way it works. But at least he got the conversation rolling. He kind of got the ball rolling as far as, okay, how have organisms changed over time? This guy here is the main person that came up with the theory of evolution that we still use today. Charles Darwin, his parents wanted him to be a doctor, so they actually sent him to medical school. He could not stand the sight of blood, and so back in the early 1800s, there's a lot of blood in medicine. There was a lot of very gruesome surgeries and whatnot, and so once he started seeing that, he couldn't handle it, and he wanted to then change and be a naturalist. So he wanted to study nature, and he got on with a crew that was going to kind of sail around the world and do an exploration. He got on with this crew as their naturalist. He was able to go around with them on this boat called the Beagle, the HMS Beagle, in 1830. And he went around for 5 years. He traveled on the Beagle, went all around the world. You can see here kind of the route of his travels. Okay, went all around, and finally got back to England after 5 years. He collected a bunch of specimens, had a bunch of data written down. And this is where he kind of came up with his whole theory of evolution as far as how organisms have changed over time. Okay, and really more why organisms have changed over time. Kind of what's that driving force behind it. The main area that he did his research, one of the main places, was called the Galapagos Islands. So the Galapagos Islands, you've heard of these set of islands before, but the Galapagos Islands were a great place for Darwin to study because they're very, very close together, so they're easily accessible. Kind of once you're in that area, you can hop over to the different islands pretty easily. But the crazy thing is that these islands, where they are geographically on the Earth, they have a very different environment on each island. So one island's kind of almost like a desert with cactus. One of them's like a rainforest. One of them is like very just barren, kind of lava rock everywhere. So all of these islands have these vast differences in the way that their terrain is, the way that they have, what food source would be there. So these islands are very a great place to kind of study evolution, and here's the reason why. So if a set of organisms come over to these islands, okay, let's say, and this is seriously what scientists think happened, that the inhabitants of the island were kind of blown over by a hurricane or something like that a long time ago. Well, one, the islands are isolated, right? So once they're there, they're not going to get off. And so a perfect example is this group of finches that Darwin studied. So if you look at the finch that's on South America, that's where these islands are closest to, it looks a certain way. But then when you visit each island has a different set of finches there. And what Darwin started noticing is the finches adapted to whatever island they're on, the food source that's on that island. So the finches that landed on the island that has, a bunch of insects to eat, well, they developed a beak that helps them to eat insects. The finches that landed on the island that has a bunch of seeds and nuts and lots of trees that drop these seeds everywhere, they developed beaks that could crush the seeds. The finches that landed on the island with the cactus, they developed a beak that could help them eat the cactus fruit. And so on all these islands, you have all these different species of finches, but they all came from one place. They all came from South America. So Darwin started thinking, okay, well, how did they develop all these different beaks if they came from one common ancestor? And again, the driving force is that food. That there was competition for food, whatever island they landed on, and the finches that had a beak that was fit for that island, they did good on that island. They were able to reproduce. They were able to have more babies and then pass on those traits of that shaped beak to their offspring. The organisms that landed on that island, the finches that landed that were not adapted to that island, were they able to reproduce? No, probably not. They probably starved to death because they didn't have a beak shaped for that specific food source. Now, you might be asking yourself, well, okay, but were their beaks already there, or did they change their beak? Remember, organisms don't intentionally change themselves. The adaptation or the difference within the population already exists. Okay? So let's say that 20 finches landed on the insect island. Okay? And out of those 20, let's say only 3 of them were able to eat insects. 3 of them had a mutation, a variation, a change in their beak that allowed them to eat insects really, really well. So the next generation then, well, now there's 7 that can eat insects really well. And there's only 13 now that aren't insect eaters. And then the next generation, it's 10 and 10. And then the next generation, it's even more. So generation after generation, the population becomes more and more insect eaters. Okay? And so again, it would be millions of years. I mean, it would take a long time, but eventually the whole population on that island would change so much that it's a totally new species. And again, why? Because the food source on that island was suited for those insect eaters. It's not like they wanted to change their beak. That change was already there. Okay? Think of it this way. For human population, let's say there's a terrible virus that starts sweeping across the world, and there's only 10% of humans have a mutation in their DNA that makes them resistant to that virus. Well, they were naturally selected for to survive, and then pass that trait on to their offspring, and so on and so on and so on. Okay? Did they, want to change their DNA in my goofy little example? No. They naturally had the adaptation already. The environment is what kind of drives that change. Okay? So it was the finch's environment, whatever island they landed on. If they had that beak that suited that island, they were going to do good and pass that on to their offspring. If they didn't have the beak that suited that island, they weren't going to do so hot. And probably weren't going to be able to reproduce very much. Okay? So the next few slides kind of talk all about that. But here's kind of a better picture of the islands and how close they are together. This is another organism that he studied, the tortoise, as well. And again, on South America, the tortoise looks different than these three, but they came from that South American tortoise. But you can see how after millions of years, they've all adapted to whatever island they landed on. Okay, this kind of explains my whole finch story, so if you're more of a visual, you need to go back and read it. You can read it there. Okay? And then this shows you more in picture form. So here's the common ancestor. Okay, here's the finch, the original one that was on South America. It was blown over to all the different islands, right? It was distributed on the islands. And so now, look how different they all look from each other, depending on the island they're on, and really, depending on the food that they eat. You can see here, the insect eaters, seed eaters, the cactus flowers, okay? So depending on what food source they had, that beak shape changed over time. Remember, it's not immediate. It took a long time. Okay? This is called, really we call this chart two things, either a phylogenetic tree or we would call it a cladogram. That would kind of work either way. And again, what this shows you is how related organisms are to each other. So if you look here, let's just look at these three, for instance. Okay? So look at that chart. Out of those three, which two would you say are most closely related to each other? Francisco?
The medium. Never mind.
No, you were on the right track.
And that other one.
Well, just read it. You can read which the medium and large or the medium and small.
Medium and small.
Why?
Because they're
Okay. Don't look at the pictures of the actual birds. Look at the chart. Look at the tree branches. Milani.
Oh, the large and medium.
Why?
Because they come from the same.
Yes. So if you look at this as like a timeline, here's one branch off, right? So the small branched off, and then the large and medium branched off. Well, here's another branching, large and medium. So this branch off occurred after this one. So that means that these two would be more closely related than, these two or these two. So you got to look at the chart. Don't try and determine the characteristics on the pictures. Look at the chart, and the chart will tell you which ones are the most closely related. Okay? So a little bit more about the finches. Okay, the ones that had the differences in their beak allowed them to successfully compete better. They could eat more, they could reproduce more, and again, they would pass that trait on to their offspring. Couple just kind of vocab terms, natural selection. Remember, it's a change in a population that occurs when organisms with a favorable variation. What does that word variation mean?
Difference.
Good. It's a fancy word for differences. In this classroom, we have variation, right? We're all different. Same thing with the finches. There was variation that already existed in the population. Okay? Remember, the finch didn't want to change. The change was already there. that change became important because of the island that the finch landed on. Okay? And then evolution would be a change in the actual allele frequency. So remember, allele just is another term for gene. So the gene frequency, when it starts changing one way or the other, we would say that species is evolving. When more and more genes for, the seed-eating beak started showing up, that finch started evolving.
Whoa.
And so then in 1859, after a lot of research, he finally published his book. It was called On the Origin of Species, and it kind of mapped out the whole idea of his theory for evolution. These were the 4 guiding principles that lead to this theory of evolution. So without these, natural selection would have a tough time occurring. So overproduction, what that means is organisms in the wild, are going to have more offspring than are going to survive. Okay, so basically it's kind of the shotgun approach. They're going to try and have a lot of babies so that hopefully that good trait gets passed on to at least some of them so that they can survive. Okay? If they only had one, like fish for example, if they only laid 1 egg, well, it's probably not going to survive. They got to lay a lot of eggs so that some of those babies are going to survive and then have that favorable trait so it can carry on with the population. Okay? Variation must exist within the population as well. Remember, y'all already said variation just means differences. Again, think about my goofy human example. If there were 0 humans that had the change in their DNA to be resistant to the virus,
We would all die.
it could cause an extinction. What?
It's not goofy. It's an epidemic.
There you go.
Wow.
Nice. So, zombie apocalypse, right? It could happen. So, it could cause extinction. If there's not variation within a population, extinction can occur. If the environment changes enough and there's no individuals that are adapted for that new environment, it could wipe out everybody, right? Okay? Adaptation. So, adaptation just means that there's a favorable change or a favorable trait within the population. All right? Let's see. I'm trying to think of another goofy example for you. So, in this room, okay, if it's, super, super cold, all right, well, yeah, let's say, like me, I've got super hairy arms, right? Well, I might be warmer than people that don't have hairy arms. That's just an adaptation. I'd be warmer that day. Okay, now in the grand scheme of things, that's not meaning anything. But it's just a natural thing that occurs that helps you in your immediate environment. Okay? Alright. Did I skip one?
Yes. That'd be no.
No.
Oh yeah, descent with modification. So, descent with modification, think of this as like each descendant is modified better and better for its environment. The bacteria that we worked with on Friday, remember, the bacteria had descendants, had little babies, and each generation was more and more resistant to the antibiotics. Okay, kind of as you read that story and put it in chronological order, you saw that the bacteria got more and more resistant to the antibiotics. Okay? And again, that's that whole idea of descent with modification. The bacteria are descending from other bacteria, and they're being modified as that occurs to better suit their environment, which was the antibiotics. Okay? All right. Last piece. Evidence for evolution. Okay? Evidence for evolution. So all these things that we're about to look at now are pieces of evidence that you can use to show like how related organisms are, or the idea of a common ancestor with organisms. The first one's structural adaptation. So things like mimicry, camouflage, Okay, how organisms have adapted to their environments with those types of things. So mimicry, like the coral snake and the king snake. Okay, the king snake mimics the coral snake, so predators will leave it alone. It didn't always look like that. It evolved to have that coloring. Okay, camouflage. There's another one there. This when species blend into their environment. Physiological adaptations. This would be like a change in their metabolic process. So remember, this is the bacteria example. The metabolic process meaning that the bacteria were able to become resistant to the penicillin. Okay? Fossils. Fossils is another piece of evidence we use. So you can dig up fossils and see how organisms have changed over time by looking at their ancestors. Okay? Anatomy. You can look at the actual anatomy of an organism. There's a couple, three main ones. One's called homologous. When you look at homologous structures of organisms, you can compare the anatomy and see that, okay, even though a whale uses its flipper to swim and a bat uses its wing to fly, if you look at x-rays of the two, they're actually built pretty much the same. They have a humerus, they have a radius and an ulna, they have carpals, they have phalanges. They both have it. So that shows the idea that there's this common ancestor that they might have shared at one time. Humans and lizards, same thing. Okay? The cat, again, all these examples, you can see they're built very similarly, even if they use their structure for a different reason. The next one would be an analogous structure. These don't have a common evolutionary origin, but they do have a similar function. So in other words, like wings, the wings of a butterfly and the wings of a bird. Structurally, they don't look the same, but functionally they are the same. They both help fly. And then the last one in this category, vestigial structures. So this is a body part or an organ that is no longer needed. Are no longer used. And so again, that kind of shows that in evolutionary history, that organ might have been needed. So a lot of people think like the appendix for humans. Okay? And look at the picture there, whales have a pelvis. Well, that states that at one time they might have been on land, right? Okay, with legs. You don't need a pelvis with flipper. Okay? Next one, comparative embryology. So when you compare embryo development, you can see the similarities between species and to see how related they are by looking at their embryo development. And there's some different examples there. And then finally, and probably the most important one, and the newest one, would be studying the DNA and seeing how similar pieces of their DNA are, and looking at the differences between DNA will tell you definitely how related organisms are. So when you map out the amino acids, okay, that make up this certain protein in humans and in yeast, you can see, well, there's 66 base differences for that certain protein between a human and a yeast. But there's only 13 base differences between a human and a pig. So which one are more related? Human and pigs or human and yeast? Human and pigs, right? Now, don't look up here. Just look at the chart, and same thing we did earlier with the finches. Look at pig, duck, and snake. Pig, duck, and snake, which two are most related?
Duck and snake.
Why?
Because they come from the same branch.
Good, because the branching off happened earlier. Later on. The branching off happened later on for the duck and the snake. Okay? All right. That is it for that.
Wait.
Yeah.
Let's